Welcome, my name is Mark Treadwell, and this is the fourth in a series of video clips that are associated with the resource Learning How the Brain Learns, and you can download that free of charge if you're watching this as a random video in the sequence from marktreadwell.com, and there's no charge for that, and you can distribute that as you wish within your environment, and we hope that's of some use to you. Meanwhile, this video clip is looking at how we build an understanding of ideas and concepts and how that actually works from terms of how your mind, how your brain actually processes that relationship. An extraordinary experiment was performed in 2012 and reported in Nature in 2013. And there was a group of people, Nancy Oberheim, Stephen Goldman, Zhang Han, and a team of people carried out what really was the most extraordinary experiment. They got female mice embryos and they added to those embryos some cells taken from the gyrus inside the human brain. And these are stem cells. These are stem cells from the human brain, and injected them into the mix, so to speak, and then impregnated the female mice again with these embryos, and the mice were born. And when they were born, they looked at the brains, and the brains were very, very different. Structurally, they were nothing like what they'd seen before in terms of a mouse brain. And then they decided to test them to see whether or not this increased number of new cells from the gyrus. Now, these new cells were the cells we referred to earlier on called astrocytes. So by adding astrocytes to the mix, so to speak, at the very beginning, these mice ended up with a much greater number of astrocytes in their brain. Okay, so they didn't have a human brain. It's called chimeric. It's a mixture of two different organisms. And they tested these mice to see whether they were any more intelligent, given the fact that they had these extra astrocytic cells. And to everybody's surprise, these mice were not just a little bit smarter, they were a lot smarter. And in some tests, up to 300% smarter. So what this did was set a benchmark, really, of people rethinking the role of astrocytes in the brain and how they affect intelligence. In this model that we're presenting work done by a lot of other researchers around the relationship between astrocytes and neurons across the synapse. So you've got three elements essentially taking place here. And synapses are connections between one neuron and another. And the astrocytes loiter around in between there. And so that relationship we often refer to as a tripartite relationship because of the three-way nature of the relationship. And we think this relationship has a lot to do with how well we learn new ideas and new concepts and how we actually map memories. So what we think is happening here is that astrocytes are actually looking for patterns. Patterns of neural connections that happen time and time again. When they recognize a pattern, they ask themselves, not obviously in a thinking way, but from a chemical way, they ask themselves, is this pattern worth mapping? And how they know whether the pattern's worth mapping depends upon which hormones have been released in the brain. And the brain somehow, the release of hormones in the brain somehow communicates to astrocytes whether or not they should map those. And there appears to be, on some astrocytes, hormone detectors that detect the hormones present, and the intensity of the hormone indicates the intensity and the speed at which that pattern should be mapped. If you think about all the memories you have, and the ones that are deeply ingrained, almost all those deeply ingrained memories come from situations where emotionally you were actually really excited or really scared. In other words, when the brain created lots of hormones and the astrocytes went, my goodness, map this pattern. Being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, map that pattern. It's very important. We need to learn this and never forget it. So we learn patterns, which we refer to as concepts, patterns between variables, as we mentioned earlier on in the previous video, We remember those depending on how passionate we are about what we're experiencing at the time, what hormones are being released in our brain. And so they tell the astrocytes to map that pattern. Now, the human brain is fantastic, but it's got a severe limitation. Its severe limitation that it has is that it can only actually process one conscious thinking process at a time. So you can only actually do one thing consciously at a time. Well, that would limit us. We could drive the car or talk to the person next to us. We could peel the carrots or keep an eye out for the children. We could do only one thing at a time. However, human beings can multitask. Both men and women, and both do it at the same capacity rating. So there's no difference in terms of multitasking other than the experiences that have built that up. So the efficiency gains human beings get is by having those astrocytes map the pattern and say to the neurons, you know what, we can predict peeling carrots, we can predict driving, so you can think about something else. And you can do a number of things simultaneously, 4 or 5 things possibly, but you can only do one thing consciously. So the astrocytes have got to map that pattern and take over that process. We have sufficient astrocytes to do that, to start the process, but as you learn more and more concepts, to map those concepts permanently once the astrocytes have recognised the pattern, they have to download more stem cells from the gyrus and turn them into astrocytes to complete the process. So as you get more clever, as you get more ideas and concepts, you get more astrocytes interrogating your neural sequences looking for more patterns. So there's an upside and a downside to this. The upside is that actually the more clever you are, the more things you can automate and the better you can multitask. Okay, so that's the upside. The downside is the more astrocytes you have interrogating your neural sequences, then the more interruption of the neural sequences and possibly the more senior moments you're going to have. In other words, if you're smart, you'll have more senior moments than someone who is less smart. Right? So this is a consequence. The next time you walk into the kitchen and go to yourself, why am I here? You can think, look, I forgot that because I'm just so jolly clever. And it's true. You forget things like that. Your senior moments. You're not getting early onset Alzheimer's. This is actually a consequence of being clever. Albert Einstein had huge problems with this as he aged because he had so many concepts in his head, so many frameworks in his head, that in fact he hadn't worked out how to still manage the sequencing process. The stuff that he's automated many years ago, getting home. Right? As people age, quite often we say to them, look, don't think about getting home, okay? Just let the process happen. And this is what often happens when people get into their 70s and 80s. They start thinking about getting home, as opposed to when we're in our 20s, 30s and 40s. We're so busy doing things, we're not even dreaming about trying to work our way home. In fact, if we had to draw a map of how we got home from our workplace or from a friend's place and write in all the streets and where we turned, we'd have no idea. Your astrocytes have mapped that into a predictable process. Okay? And that's where we think astrocytes make the difference in human beings. We are able to actually learn new concepts, map those patterns on the fly. And that allows for what we often call automaticity. You know, we're out there playing soccer. We're not thinking about every movement of dribbling the ball. We're not out there playing netball thinking about who I'll pass to next. It's happening in a flash, very, very quickly, as your astrocytes predict the best sequence to work through and put that into place. So your brain is extraordinary. And this experiment carried out just a couple of years ago and reported on just in 2013 is actually demonstrating that these astrocytes allow us to form memories, long-term memories, that actually don't have a short-term, medium-term, long-term. Okay? They go straight to long-term. And we think our astrocytes, when it comes to ideas and concepts, are also involved in the memory process. and they map those processes in what we call a holographic format, which we'll talk more about later. In other words, we can take out half your brain and you don't lose your long-term memory or your short-term memory. Okay, your temporary memory, yeah, that goes. But in fact, there's a number of patients around the world who've had that part of their brain removed. But we'll talk about more of that when we talk about memory later on. So when it comes to ideas and concepts, ideas form first, and then through numerous contexts, the astrocytes gradually learn the general pattern for that tree losing its leaves, steering the car, braking, because braking is mathematically very challenging. It's the rate at which we slow down over a period of time so we arrive just at that line, which is calculus. Okay, so every time we slow down for a stop sign or a traffic light or wherever it might be, you're calculating that out through a calculus process, which your astrocytes have mapped and automated, so you don't even have to think about it. I'll leave it there for this one on understanding ideas and concepts. And in the next series, we'll start looking at what creativity is all about and how that relates to innovation and ingenuity. So thank you very much. You can go away now and read this chapter if you want to do some backup reading, and use the links in the resource to go and find additional information. And we'll come back to you in the next video. Thank you very much.